this is something that I kind of want to help work towards, that sustainability of health behavior changes. So one of the ways to help people change is a motivation-based intervention, and specifically in my case, motivational interviewing, which is a therapy approach that intends to help people find their own reasons for change and find their own ways to create that change. And the automated delivery of motivational interviewing via conversational agents has shown to have potential benefits. But the problem is that a lot of automated conversational agents that try to do motivational interviewing so far, they're very strict. They have like very rule-based frameworks, and they don't really offer the flexibility that normal motivational interviewing, as done by a counselor or a therapist, would have. So to create that more expansive way of doing motivational interviewing in an automated manner, there's like two major building blocks, and one of them is understanding, and the other is reacting in a suitable way, which is probably, I mean, now that I look at it, is probably the main two building blocks of every conversational agent. But here, like, the understanding is not only understanding what the user says, but what he actually means most of the time. So I'm dealing with both of those components in the course of my project, and I'm going to start summarizing what I've done so far for the understanding part, and then the second half of the presentation will be what I am intending to do or doing right now to do the reacting part. So there's a pretty handy way to look at understanding in motivational interviewing, which are client codes. And those client codes are usually used to evaluate motivational interviewing sessions. And I have, at the beginning of my PhD, adapted those to work for written conversation. So this is a bit complicated at first, but it's actually quite simple. I'm going to try to do the, oh yeah, okay. So every utterance of the user or the client can be assigned a valence, which is change talk if it's in favor of change, and sustained talk if it's in favor of the status quo or in favor of not changing. And then each utterance also gets a label, which would be either reason, so a reason for or against changing, commitment, which would be a commitment for the near future, or taking steps, which would be like steps that have recently been taken towards or against change. And then reason can be further subcategorized into desire, ability, and need. So the desire would be a reason that is mainly based on what the client wants, whereas ability is more talking about what they feel capable of. And then there's like two minor categories that are also there in the traditional annotation scheme that I'm kind of setting aside. One of them is follow neutral, which would just be anything that's not related to motivation in the conversation. And other is everything that's related to motivation but doesn't really fit in any of the other categories. So I'm dealing less with those. I also use them for my initial annotation. So what I did using those codes was I looked at data from two subforums of Germany's largest weight loss forum. The reason why I chose a weight loss forum is because it's almost impossible to get actual conversation transcripts, because there's usually patient-client data problems, like they aren't allowed to share their conversations, stuff like that. So I kind of resorted to the next best thing, which would be like the written forum-based conversations. And I looked at those two subforums and identified posts which contain change or sustain talk. And then all of those posts, which was like a very small share of the original 7,000 posts. So I was left with 1,200 posts, which contained either change or sustained talk or both. And I looked at those on a sentence-to-sentence basis and annotated them with all of those labels and valences, which I've shown on the last slide. And again, a very small share was actually connected to change at all. So I ended up with 4,724 sentences, which are actually related to behavior change specifically. Okay, so that I used to train a classifier. So I split it into 3 data sets, one for the valence, one for the labels, and one for the sublabels, and train a classifier for each of them. And predicting works pretty well. So like this is the performance on the test set. So it was a kind of a first start, and it showed me that it's working fairly well, but we have a problem because for one, the data is super unbalanced. So for some of those sublabels, for example, there's the smallest sublabel, I only have a few hundred samples, whereas for the largest, I have like thousands. And also, I mean, it would be nice to be more reliable with the prediction, because later on I want to work on that understanding of each utterance to react accordingly. So I tried a few different things to get that prediction or the classifier performance up. Oh, sorry, I don't have my presenter mode, so there's another part. Like, okay, so I'm gonna do this first. There are also differences between the forum data and traditional spoken or written conversations. So one of them is synchronicity. The forum data is very asynchronous because it's usually like one monologue and then another monologue that kind of reacts to it. So it's like very asynchronous conversation, whereas like a text-based chat interface would have more synchronous conversation. Also, we have that difference between human-human and human-bot conversation. We have a different conversation mode with the long form post versus like short messages. And then also, this is kind of multi-party conversation where not the same 2 people speak the entire time. So I collected additional data from different contexts and domains. So this might be a bit hard to read, but for example, another thing I did was look at the same mode of conversation, but with a different topic. So I collected the same kind of data from a smoke stop forum. And then I have a few different corpora that are very small, that are more based on synchronous conversation. So, for example, the health coaching dialogue corpus, it was an existing data collection that was based on people trying to increase their step count. So I used that and annotated that as well to kind of check how well my classification performance on the original data set transfers to different domains. So I have all of those different data sets that have different contexts and different features. And I tested my classifiers on those data sets, and we can see that for some of them it works pretty well, and then for some classes the transfer works pretty well, but for others it really doesn't. So now I'm getting back to the ways I tried to increase performance, because I wanted to increase performance both on my original data set, but of course also on the different data sets to kind of be able to, in the end, predict on an actual text-based conversation. So one thing I tried was introducing synthetic data, and for that we identified different topics from our weight loss forum data and used prompt-based GPT-3 to ask it questions that have to do with those topics. And those questions were formed in a way that they would induce different labels. So for example, for the taking steps label, we would have a question about what steps the GPT-3 has recently taken to lose weight. And I use that data to increase the data set of my original classifier, and tried to and then fine-tuned a new BERT instance. And then I basically had a look if that improved anything, which it didn't. I also tried using kind of like a fuzzy annotation approach where I used my original classifier to create or to annotate labels for the GPT-3 data and use that to fine tune. But in like both of those conditions didn't have any improvement for my original label. So in fact, it actually classification got worse. So I didn't continue on that road. Another thing we briefly tried was paraphrasing. So paraphrasing the data I already have and using that to increase the data set size. So for that, we generated 20 paraphrases for each data point and then chose the paraphrases that were the least similar to the original data and use that to kind of get a bigger data set. But also here, we didn't really see any improvements. Most of the time, it got worse. So that brings me to what I'm doing while I'm here, or like the main project I'm doing while I'm here, which is using fuzzy annotation on actual user data. So we started out with crawling additional data from the weight loss forum that I used initially for my annotation. So basically, since I first collected data, 1.5 years have passed, and now I crawled all of the data that has come onto the forum since then, which isn't much. So there's not very much interaction there, but I had like 900 additional sentences, and we applied my current classifier on those new sentences to create those fuzzy annotations, and then tried different confidence thresholds to see which one will increase classification. And that is the point where we are currently at. Once we have a classifier that increases classification with those fuzzy annotations, we can test this, or we can use different data from different sources to kind of get that domain transfer in there. So especially if anyone has like insight on that kind of topic, that would be something I would definitely like to hear about. Okay. So this is kind of the understanding part done, or what I've done so far for the understanding. And now I'm going to move on quickly or briefly to reaction, which is basically the future work for the project. Okay, so the general idea is, since I have a basic understanding of what the user says with the help of my labels and valances, I would like to be able to react in different ways depending on what the user said. So if, let's say, a person says something positive they have done in the recent past that takes them closer to their behavior change, I would want to react with an affirmation of that. Or if they talk about a commitment they have for the close future of having, like, doing something positive for change, I would like to ask about potential barriers, so they are already prepared for those potential barriers coming up and can reflect like what would get in the way of that in order to prepare. And so this is like one of the components, creating a dialogue framework to react to each of those user input classes. And this is the point where I will have to work together with like motivational interviewing experts who can tell me which label has the best suitable reaction. And then using that framework, I would like to use GPT-3 to to generate replies. So, I mean, GPT-3 is a bit dangerous because you never really know what's going to happen. So what we're doing right now is we're kind of evaluating the feasibility of using GPT-3 for our use case, and we created a very kind of complicated annotation scheme to evaluate outputs, which we can use to test different prompts to give to GPT-3. So we basically looked in the literature a lot and identified different empathy markers. Also looked into both like general empathy literature as well as the motivational interviewing based literature. And we have 19 items across 5 dimensions that we use for our annotation scheme. And the largest chunk here is the harmful dimension, which is basically anything we really don't want in our use case. One of them is, for example, giving like fact-based information, which is something we want to avoid coming from GPT-3 because like it's not to be trusted, but also like openly confrontational or critical behavior, or the chatbot revealing own emotions or talking about their personal life, which is something that we don't really want coming from a chatbot. And then we have a small part here, which is like structural, like, is it grammatically correct? Is it, yeah, does it actually react to what the user said, or does it start a completely new topic? So we are currently working on refining that annotation scheme in a way that it will be able to be applied with a high confidence by different people. So that way we're hoping that I won't have to do all of those that annotation, but it's going to be able to be given to like crowd workers, something like that. And so for that to work, we still need to fine tune it a little bit, so to say. But once that works, we are planning on trying different GPT-3 prompts, and I have like very shallow examples here of what we've already tested, to find the best suited prompts to create certain behaviors and hopefully build a classifier on the harmful outputs in order to be able to exclude them before they're like voiced to a actual person. So, and then what's left is basically putting the two together. And I'm not gonna be able to create a working system that can be used in the wild during my PhD. But what we're like planning to do right now is implementing a chatbot that can be used in a Wizard of Oz kind of controlled user study, where the wizard would only be there to make sure that no harmful output is given to the user. So basically, they would just be the human in the loop to on one hand to filter out stuff that we don't want, and on the other hand to record how much stuff we get that we don't want. And then we have some open questions like, how do we measure the success of the chatbot? Like, do we want to look at engagement, or do we want to look at the share of change versus sustained talk in the beginning versus the end of the conversation? Or do we want to measure the commitment to change before and after, and stuff like that? Okay, so that was the breakdown. I have a brief summary of everything on the last slide, and I'm looking forward to questions. You mean the first corpus? Yeah, that was manual annotation. So I annotated all of that, and then a colleague annotated parts of it to see that we agree. But yeah, all of it was human annotation, and now we're trying out the automatic annotation to increase the size of the data set. No, I used so I think there isn't a German paraphrasing, or I couldn't find a German paraphrasing model. So what we actually did is we used the Facebook. Marcus knows which one it was. Yeah, the Facebook paraphrasing model, and I translated my data into English first, and then I paraphrased and translated it back into German. Which usually like is a data augmentation technique by itself, right? But I think because like translation from German to English, it works so well that sometimes the paraphrased and back translated data was exactly the same as the original data, so there really wasn't much variation there. Yeah. Yeah. So far, I've only looked at the sentence itself, so I isolated. I thought about maybe introducing context, especially for the valence classifier, because that one relies a bit more on context than the labels and sublabels. For the labels and sublabels, usually you have like specific text markers in the sentence that kind of tell you, okay, this is a taking step. Like if something is said in the past, it's usually taking steps as opposed to something else. But for the valence, I think maybe incorporating context could be useful. I'm not really sure how to do that though, so I just haven't done it so far. Yeah, so there's a kind of an evaluation framework in motivational interviewing. It's called the Motivational Interviewing Skill Code, and it includes those client behaviors as well as therapist codes. So they essentially they evaluate both the therapist behavior and then how the user reacts, the client in that case, reacts to it. So I kind of adapted those to make them a bit easier so they can actually be applied to written conversation, because usually you would have like a very complicated way of segmentating like the utterances into different parts and stuff like that, and that would make classification very complicated, because first you would have to identify which part of the sentence is the most important, and then you would have to stuff like that. So and also I didn't really include that, but I had a few sentences that had multiple labels, and I'm not using those right now, so because it was only like 3% of the data, so I just kind of kept it out. But some of them had like 2 or 3 labels in one sentence. Mhm. Yeah, so I basically just use the confidence that is returned by the classifier. Um, and I can go back to the slide maybe. Yeah, so here, this is basically an overview of the different confidence thresholds I tried out. I have 2 classifiers involved here. One is the follow neutral, so everything that's not connected to motivation at all. Which is the first like instance. So in some of those conditions, I use that classifier where I first use the follow neutral versus motivational talk, let's say, classifier to weed out all of that information that really isn't related to motivation at all. So like small talk or I don't know, people asking for factual information, something like that. Um, And then I use the valence classifier, or in this case, it's the label classifier. So one of my other classifiers. And I tried different confidence thresholds. So, and different combinations of confidence thresholds. So here, for example, we have the classifier for the follow neutral versus motivational talk returned. I used all data points where the confidence was over 50%, and then for the valence as well. And then I tried different combinations. So sometimes confidence had to be over 70% for me to include it in the new data set, or like up to 95%. Okay. Yeah.
Because there is no fuzzy model.
Right. Yeah.
I would call it just pseudo annotation. It's just annotation based on her own classifier.
So right. Yeah. So maybe that was just I'm not familiar with the lingo. So. Right. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The name is confusing.
Okay, so I'll change that. Thanks for pointing that out. Yeah.
Chinese nowadays in many other chatbots and areas. So you have some plans of how to build experiments for evaluating successful is your chatbot for changing the behavior of the.
Yeah. I mean, so one thing we thought about, for example, was splitting each conversation with the conversational agent in half, and then looking at the first half of the conversation and look at the share of change versus sustained talk, or the like how the people talked there, and then looking at the second half and see if it changed. I'm not sure if that is gonna work though. Another possibility would be to ask for the commitment to change. So, for example, there is a form or a survey basically you can use to measure stage of change. So stages of change, of behavior change, can be compartmentalized into pre-contemplation, which is someone not thinking about change at all, and then contemplation, where they start thinking, and then there's preparation and action, and finally maintenance. So those are the stages of change. And I would suspect that, for example, with a conversation like that, if it were working properly, we could maybe push someone from the pre-contemplation to the contemplation stage, or from the contemplation to the preparation stage briefly. So before versus after the conversation. But yeah, I think that is, in the best case, you would like to do a long-term study. But I'm not going to have time for that during my PhD. So maybe that would be something left for future, like for potential postdoc or something. Like we're thinking about submitting a grant proposal to keep working on this topic after I'm done. So then we could actually do that and do like a controlled study and everything. But in the scope of my PhD, I think it's just not going to be possible to do that. So we're basically like thinking of working with one conversation per user and finding markers that could tell us success within that conversation. Yeah.
That change is good if I am fat, right? But if I was fat, already changed, and now I am very good physical condition, then perhaps the sustain talk is what I need, right? So this depends on the current state of the user, right?
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, that is completely new can of worms where you actually have to find ways to control that people don't use it to like foster harmful behaviors. Yeah. So far I'm using OpenAI. Yeah. Yeah, so so I've tried a few alternatives and they're really bad compared to GPT-3, at least the ones I've tried so far. So I'm kind of settling on GPT-3 for now. I mean, what I'm hoping to achieve with that annotation scheme is maybe be able to build a classifier that will discern good from bad output, and that could hopefully be used for different language models as well. But so right now GPT-3 is becoming like they lowered the price, so it's pretty cheap right now as long as you don't fine tune and you don't have like thousands of accesses in a day. Yeah. Yeah. I'm kind of hoping that I don't know. I mean, they're working on GPT-4 right now, so I'm just hoping by the time they're out with that, GPT-3 will be free. So Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, the thing is, I don't see how. So what I'm kind of trying to do right now is like prompting different behaviors to GPT-3, depending on what the user said, and I haven't really found a different way to do that yet. But like, if you have ideas on that, we can definitely talk because that would be really interesting. I'm just like, for example, I tried out Bloom briefly, and it just like I prompted it in German, and I didn't even get a German reply. It was something about the Bank of America, something, and it had nothing to do with what I wrote. Which maybe it was just like a singled out occurrence or something, but it was weird. And I kind of want to do more than just rule-based generation, mainly because I want that flexibility that the rule-based ways don't really give us. So that's why I thought like doing a semi-rule-based chatbot using like a large language model that we can prompt using those different rules might be able to give that flexibility that we don't have so far. But yeah, I mean, there's always that extra step of evaluation of every output that you need. So it does introduce extra steps. Yeah. Thank you for your comments.